Yeah, just skip it. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode 389, recorded on the 4th of August in 2021 to talk about logic apps. And on Teams with me, we have our very special guest, Bec Lyons, who's going to be talking about logic apps, as well as our usual hosts, Sujit, Evan, and myself, Cynthia. And we will get straight to Bec this time. Bec, can you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us what you do at Microsoft.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. So Bec Lyons, I'm a program manager on the Azure Logic Apps team, which sits a part of our Azure organization. So essentially, I focus on all things DevOps and hybrid and enterprise readiness for Logic Apps, amongst some other bits and bobs such as the BizTalk Migrator. We've also got a range of other folks on the team who cover the designer and all our connector ecosystem. So it's a pleasure to be representing the team today on the podcast.
BizTalk. I haven't heard BizTalk in a while. I always get excited when I see that it's still around and still kicking and people still use it. A lot of people still use it.
A lot of people still use BizTalk. The piece that I'm working on specifically is the BizTalk migration tool. Of course, we've just released BizTalk 2020, so that's a new instance if people want to upgrade. But if people do want to modernize, they can choose to use the migrator to help them move across to Azure.
So, Bec, I want to first ask you about the standard logic apps that came out probably a couple weeks ago. What is new about it and why should we care?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just announced our new standard SKU, which went generally available at Build, which seems like a couple of weeks ago, but that was all the way in, May, which this year is going very fast. So essentially the standard SKU, at the crux of it, we've replatformed the Logic Apps engine that you know and love onto the functions runtime. Now, that's a key piece because it does unlock a lot of new capabilities that we've never had before in Logic Apps. So some key functionalities include things like private IP and VNet integration. So if you do want to inject your Logic app into a virtual network, you have the ability to do so without needing a more heavy-duty ISE or an ASE to run it. Amongst other things, we have refreshed the designer. So if you've played around with the new standard SKU, you might notice a new look and feel. The same connectors are there, the same flow and actions as in consumption you will have in standard. It's just a nice new look and feel. And on our roadmap, we are going to be moving across that designer so that everyone can take advantage of the nice new fresh coat of paint. Amongst other things, there is a vast developer and DevOps improvement. Originally with consumption, if you wanted to do any type of development or testing, this had to be against a live resource in Azure, which worked fine. You can do it from Visual Studio, but you would need some sort of presence there in Azure. With the new standard SKU, you can now completely run locally and dev and test without having to deploy to Azure, which is really nice in terms of treating your Logic apps much like you would any type of application code itself, while also being able to take advantage of that low-code, no-code designer straight from your development tools itself. So I'm only scratching the surface of all the new goodness in the standard SKU. There's a whole bunch of new features that a lot of people are really loving and appreciating. So it's really great to see the feedback in the community.
Yeah, Bec, I think recently we had somebody from the Azure Arc team that was talking about some of the features that are available there. And I believe now you can also deploy Logic apps to Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes clusters on premises. Is that correct?
Exactly. So one of the other benefits of running on the functions runtime is we do have a more flexible runtime, which doesn't have to run on Azure anymore. So like how I can run it locally on my developer laptop, I can also run it on hosts that aren't sitting on Azure. So Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster is the ability to run your Azure PaaS services on infrastructure you control, which is really nice, giving you the ability to work with Logic apps and functions and web apps much like you would if they were running on Azure. But now the region or the location that it's running on, it might be even just a local Kubernetes cluster on your laptop, or something sitting under your desk, or maybe something that you've built up from scratch on premises. So it provides a whole bunch more flexibility in terms of where we run our Logic apps, which in particular, because Logic apps is an integration tool, bringing services and systems together, point A to point B, if you can host and run your logic apps alongside those different services, it just makes the whole system go a lot smoother. So it's a really cool announcement and a cool capability that has just been announced. So yeah.
That's yeah, I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to run it in Azure, but no. You know, when you talk about the designer stuff, that's really interesting to me because I have to confess, I have not seen the new designer, but it does sound from what I've heard that it is, you know, some nice upgrades there. And you said that's being ported to the other SKUs and everything as well. But like, do I get all that same goodness if I'm coming in through VS Code or I'm coming in through all these different? Because you know, people like all different environments. I don't always want to be in a web browser. Does that sort of coolness come through all those different channels as well, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the standard SKU, when you run the designer in Azure, you get the exact same functionality if you're running on a VS Code. There are a couple of different differences in terms of because in VS Code you can see the files and directly, you know, manipulate them there, whereas on the portal there's just a different UI for accessing those things. For example, connections. When you do it in VS Code, you access all the metadata through a connections.json file. When you're in Azure, you access all the connections information via the connections tab. Just a different way of exposing those different backends. So the designer itself, it actually runs on the same process on the portal and in the VS Code environment. So you'll be getting the same goodness regardless of where you want to run it.
Okay, great. So that really does say, like, regardless of where I run my runtime, I can also do my development work, and sort of everything I learn about how to do it over here applies over there, instead of having, like, you know, hey, you know, this is like the really hard one, like, you know, hey, I'm messing with the JSON file to get it done. Well, yeah, I can do it, but that's okay. I don't have that. That's great. That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of following up on that, does that mean in terms of the development experience and for like application lifecycle management, there is code that you can actually go through, like commits, or is it blocks of things that you kind of see in the designer? Like, how do you manage the changes?
Yeah, great question. So we like Logic Apps is a low code, no code tool, but at the end of the day, it's really configuration as code. If you kind of look at the different services on the spectrum, you look at functions, that's code as a service, whereas Logic Apps adds a little bit more abstraction away. You don't have to write code to be able to connect all your different services. That's where the connectors come in. It's just essentially configuration. So step A runs, step B does this, it uses these inputs, and then it goes to step C, and a bunch more complexity if you want. Behind the scenes, it's all JSON code. So that is code that you can treat as code. You check it up into source control whenever you add a new action, or whenever you change a parameter or a new input or output. That can all get checked up into source control. You can build your different build and release pipelines around that, and actually treat your logic apps as if it's application code itself, and have all the enterprise rigor around that without actually having to write a line of code itself.
Now, I understand, Bec, that when you run Logic Apps in Azure, obviously, you know, Azure is paying for the compute to run your code, right? Yeah, whatever you run your steps. Now, when you run it on premises, obviously Azure is not paying for the compute. You're paying for it somehow. The customers, that is. How does that change the pricing model for running Logic Apps, you know, in an on-premises world versus in Azure?
Yes. So if you're talking about running Logic Apps on-prem, you're probably looking at running it on Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, which I don't have anything to announce today in terms of pricing. That is in public preview at the moment, so we haven't announced the billing construct for that yet. So that is definitely a to be determined and will be announced. When running it on Azure compared to consumption, because consumption is more of a multi-tenant type approach where we will run your workflows, we will manage all of that goodness and the storage and the state kind of in a shared economy type sense. It made sense for us to do it per billable action. So every time you run an action, we will just calculate the compute that it took to run that action, and that's what you would be billed. When you look at running it in standard, it's more of a single tenant model, much like if you've run Elastic Premium for functions. Under the hood, we essentially give you a worker VM, and that is what is abstracted away as that workflow standard plan. So you're really paying for the compute for that particular underlying construct, which runs your logic apps. And you're also bringing your own storage account. That storage account is enabling you to give you the keys to the kingdom in terms of where your state is stored, how you treat that state, if you want GRS, if you want to go and poke around and see what we're actually storing in there, that's now in your realm of control. So 2 different models, 2 different pricing constructs, just because of how we structure all the underlying resources. One being shared multi-tenant, one being single tenant, so it is more compute based.
So when I go to the single tenant model, this sounds roughly analogous to the web apps and app service environments construct. It that seems like that would bring along the fact that now I have my NSGs. It's sort of working in my VNet. All that kind of is that implied in this design change as well, or are there these new capabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other benefits of replatforming into functions is, yes, we do absorb a lot of that goodness from the app service in the functions world. So a lot of the capabilities that you've been doing for years with app service or functions, you can now apply to logic apps. So private endpoints VNet integration, a perfect example of that. We are working towards, more parity between those different products. So we're hoping to light up things like deployment slots, easy auth, all those different things. So that is definitely on our roadmap and something that we're looking to light up as soon as possible.
Okay, but functionally, with the big change that you've made, like now this is call it like a first class resource in my VNet. At that point, again, it's not necessarily exactly the same but conceptually, I can now think about it just like I do with VM in terms of how I want to secure it, how I want to access it, things like that. Okay, that's great.
I would say there's a level, and there's a skew based on what your networking or security needs are. If you're happy with consumption and do things like IP restriction and a couple other things to restrict that particular PaaS environment, then yeah, consumption works great and you can do it at per action basis. If you do need VNet injection, i.e. you need your logic app to resolve the private address space and be able to sit behind a firewall or sit on a private address space, then yeah, private endpoints will give it that private address space so that things sitting on your VNet can talk to it. VNet integration will allow it to resolve private IP and talk outbound, potentially across express route to resources that sit on your private address space on-prem. For example, if you had the SQL connector and you wanted to connect to a SQL on-prem and you're using the built-in connection, this would be able to go via VNet integration, via the VNet, and then express route and all that goodness.
Okay, yeah, I hadn't even thought about hybrid connectivity in that context. Okay, yeah, that opens up a lot of capabilities.
A lot of goodness gets unlocked by that. The third option, if those kind of capabilities don't satisfy a lot of requirements, we do work with a lot of banks and financial institutions where their requirements are that we need this dedicated to us. It must sit on our VNet. With the previous option, it's kind of injection, so it still runs in the PaaS world, but the inbound and outbound is secured. If you need everything to do with that PaaS environment dedicated to you on your virtual network, so in a sense, VNet isolation versus VNet injection or VNet integration, then we do have a couple options there. So if you want to run consumption, then we have something called an integration service environment or an ISE, which essentially just takes all of the underlying compute to make that consumption plan work, but it just puts it on your VNet. Alternatively, with the new standard SKU, if you want to run that particular platform, then you can run that on an ASE. And ASE v3 was just announced a couple of weeks ago, so that does take away that stamp fee. It's a lot more flexible, so that will provide a lot of different choices for people to run their logic apps.
Great, that's awesome.
So I got a question around connectors. So I'm sure there's a lot of connectors that are out there already. Can people develop their own connectors? And is there a marketplace of connectors that other people develop as well?
That is a wonderful question. With something that we're discussing internally, but not today. You can create your own custom connectors and share them within your organization. We have 2 separate models for that. One is more config XML based for the consumption SKU. One is more code driven, which is actually an extension of the functions bindings. So if you've ever built a functions binding extension, then it is using the same infrastructure under the hood. So will be familiar to a lot of functions developers. And you can actually reuse the same code and frameworks that we use to build our own built-in connections, you can build your own. So if you have something that's a bespoke protocol that we don't have support for in the 450 plus connector ecosystem, then absolutely you can build your own.
Bec, we had recently April Dunn on our show talk about the Power Platform, and
Nice.
she was talking about Power Automate, and how that has a lot of features that I guess Logic Apps has, and maybe it does leverage some of Logic Apps. How does one decide which is the better option for you? Logic Apps or Power Automate?
Yeah, it's a great question. The underlying engine actually is Logic Apps. So the reason why the platforms are so similar is because under the hood, it uses that same base. We do share all of the same connections. So when you're building things in Logic Apps and you see the SharePoint connection, or you're building things in Power Automate and you see that same connection, it's the same infrastructure behind the scenes. So there is a lot of overlap in terms of functionality. The difference is the use case and the people who are going to be using it and how you're going to be using it. So Power Automate is tied to Office 365 subscription. So when you log in with your account, you're creating flows, and Power Automate is tied to your user. And that is particularly targeted at the business user, automating things in your realm, in your organization, in your team, to enable citizen developers to be super productive without needing to write a line of code. Logic Apps is, in the Azure space, so you get better integration with other Azure pieces, with the other integration services like API management, Service Bus, and Event Grid. It's great for really complex, high critical business scenarios where you need DevOps, or you need VNet integration, or you need a bunch of different other things, authentication, all that goodness. So very similar functionality, just different use cases based on where they are hosted and where those actual products lie. So more business user for Power Automate, more enterprise, IT pro, developer in the Azure space.
So I'll take Sajid's question and sort of go one step further. Like, so if I've got a Power Automate and I go, hey, I want some of the Azure goodness that comes with this. I want ARM templates and like Logic Apps, and if I need this VNet integration, now I'm using the standard SKU. When I look at from a functionality perspective, like Azure Data Factory, in terms of sort of I can have sort of stepwise things that are happening and dependencies. Where should I? And again, that has some of the integration things that you're talking about. Saying like, how should I be looking at those two? If I'm in Automate today. Totally self-serving question, by the way. I actually have this problem. Should I be like, hey, Logic Apps, no brainer, that's where I should start unless something sends me else? Or should I be, is there a set of criteria that I should be going to look at somewhere that says, hey, if you're doing A, B, C, and D, go ADF. If you're doing E, F, G, and H, Logic Apps is your friend. Like, what's the right way to think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll address that question similarly to the previous question. Under the hood, we do reuse the same engine and the same connections for both.
I love
so that's
it.
why there's a little bit of overlap. But this one, there's a lot more differentiation.
If you told me it's biz talk underneath all of it, it'll just make my day.
No. So there's a little bit more of a defined line in the sand for Data Factory and Logic Apps, and there's a lot more defined use cases of when to use what, which. Data Factory is great for big data batch processing, ETL, ELT type processing. So it's things like I think it's SSIS that SQL used to do. That's a perfect use case for Data Factory. If you have a lot of data coming in, if you need to do a lot of transformations across a batch amount of data, or you're streaming data in and you want to do machine learning and different transformations and pump that out to different services, then that is a great use case for Data Factory. Logic Apps is awesome for event-driven programming. So you have one thing coming in, you need to react on it and orchestrate a bunch of different APIs and services behind the scenes. We've got more of an enterprise SaaS-based slant. So an event happens, it might even be triggered from Data Factory, where we plunk something into a SQL DB. That triggers an event, a Logic App fires up. Okay, I take that, I do a bit of processing in API 1, I go to API 2 to get some more validation. I might put this in SAP, send it off to Dynamics for further processing, and then send a notification to my email admin. Like, it's event-driven versus big batch data processing. So that's
makes
the way I usually think of it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I like the concept of sort of the event-driven versus the ETL, or for those of us been around a while, the SSIS piece. Like makes a lot. You could sort of force fit to do some of the same things, but it's not the goal.
Yeah, you could use Logic Apps to do a lot of what Data Factory does. You can use Data Factory for a lot of Logic Apps does. It doesn't have to be an either or. They do work great together, and because we share the same connections, being able to chain Data Factory pipelines with your Logic Apps workflows works really well.
Great, thank you.
No worries.
Bec, I did an open hack or something recently for Logic Apps. I've been programming in .NET for many years, and I struggled quite a bit to get through some of the Logic Apps components, trying to understand how to connect them, how variables work, input, output, things like that. And I was wondering, what is the target audience for like, obviously it's not somebody like me, because I think I struggle a little bit too much for it. But are those concepts made for someone to be able to do it without that kind of level of object orientation programming and things like that? Like, what's the mindset of a developer, a citizen developer, or a developer at a company to have to use Logic Apps effectively?
Yeah, the target audience is very broad, based on the amount of customers that we have. We have people using it who are IT professionals, to citizen integrators, to actual developers, and beyond. The goal of Logic Apps is to enable organizations to be really productive and create end-to-end integrations to a vast variety of systems without having to write a line of code. So the prerequisites aren't that you are a developer or that you know how to do object-oriented programming. It should be, I need to achieve this particular piece of functionality, and I want to do that as quickly and as efficiently as possible with my time. So the connectors are there so that you don't have to write code to talk to SAP or talk to Dynamics. I just want to create a new item in there. So I authenticate, I pass all the information they need, and then I can go and move on to the next step. That being said, the onboarding experience is something that we are working on. So we are looking at getting feedback from the community on how you found your first experience with Logic Apps to be, where did you find the sticking points, and so that we can enable a smoother experience so that anyone can just dive in at any point and get going and take advantage of all that goodness that does lie at the core of Logic Apps.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I asked the question is, April said that the Power platform was kind of based on Excel, right? The Excel programming language. And we know that everybody knows Excel, at least in any organization. So it's easy for somebody like that to take it on. So I was wondering if there was any, is there any other similar background for the developers that use Logic Apps that you can say, hey, if you know how to do this, you can use Logic Apps,
Yeah. If you know how to use business,
just making a comment. You don't have to answer the question. I was just telling you why I asked the question.
Yeah.
It's because of that comment that April made earlier.
Yeah. No, I would say it's quite a unique platform. I wouldn't liken it to anything except for Power Automate and Data Factory. So if you use Power Automate, then you'll know how to use Logic Apps, and vice versa. If you use Logic Apps, you'll know how to use Power Automate. But it is a unique offering that we have at Microsoft. So it is moving away from code, and we don't want prerequisites for people jumping. We want people to jump in and be successful. That's essentially it. So I don't have a good analogy that I can use, but we are working on onboarding just to make it as simple as possible.
Bec, what is the collaboration experience when you're working on low code or no code, like in Logic Apps? Like, how can I build something with Evan, for instance?
Yeah, easy. So because it lies on Azure, you can use the same collaboration tools and experience you would with any other Azure service. So with Azure, we use role-based access control to give access or deny access based on who you are and what your role is. So if you wanted to work on a Logic app together, absolutely, you can dive into the portal and develop it there. Or much like you would with any other piece of code, you could have it sourced on GitHub or Azure DevOps, pull the code, work on it collaboratively, and then push up your changes as you would any other piece of code. So you can collaborate on the portal. You can do it as you would any other application logic. It's very broad with how you do that.
I'm just thrilled Cynthia wants to work on something with me.
Yeah, what are you going to build?
I do want to ask, if I may, one last question on Bec. And this is, you mentioned about the migrate option. I think you're working on a migrate toolkit or something to get from BizTalk to, like, I'm just curious. I mean, I used to do BizTalk many years ago. I think when 2010, BizTalk Server 2010 or something like that. I'm just curious how many customers, still use BizTalk and, to make that market available where you have to have a migrate toolkit.
Yeah, I mean,
Cynthia's asking what is BizTalk. Maybe
Cynthia.
Sure how old I am.
How long do we have? I can give an overview.
I should probably define it. No, there you go.
BizTalk is one of our oldest and most mature products that we have at Microsoft. It is as old as SQL. So if you know how many people are running SQL, you can imagine how many people would be running BizTalk. We have a lot of organizations around the world running their business critical integrations on that platform. And it is something that we keep updated. BizTalk 2020 was just released this and last year. And so we are still supporting our customers running on that platform. However, we know that where the industry is going and where organizations are going is to the cloud. So our investments in terms of our platform are going where our customers want to be, which is serverless, cloud native, as well as hybrid multi-cloud with the Azure Arc enabled announcements as well. So BizTalk is still there. It still supports a number of our customers. I can't disclose how many, but it is it's an important asset to the Microsoft business.
And Bec, to wrap up, any call to action for listeners, what they should look at in terms of logic apps, what they should try out, or any new updates they should look forward to in the next couple months?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, give Standard a go. Spin up on Azure, use a free account, and give it a go. And we've got a bunch of different samples on our GitHub repository, so you can check those out if you want to look at how do I DevOps my logic app, or how do I create an Arc-enabled logic app. So those are a new samples that we've just announced. Have a look at our docs. Follow us on YouTube. We run a monthly webinar where we go through our roadmap, we go through feedback and Q&A. So that's the perfect place to get in touch with us and tune in.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bec.
Thanks, everyone.